So we're very delighted to have three very seasoned and illustrious representatives from both the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha, people with rich experience in administration and holding office. And I'll begin by introducing the Honorable Yashwant Sinha, who is a native of Bihar, who has a background in political science. He was a long-standing member of the IAS and holding many different posts during that time. He was then elected to the Rajya Sabha in 1988. He then became, over two different terms, Finance Minister of India, and first in November 90 to 91, and then later on from 1998 to 2002, during very, very key moments in India's reform history. And he was also later on, then he moved on to take an interest in broader world affairs and was the chairman of the Development Committee of the World Bank and the IMF, and has been involved in a number of international initiatives. He also became the External Affairs Minister of India for 2 years, from 2002 to 2004, and he is presently the chairman of the Parliament Standing Committee on Finance. And I should also say he's also a great lover of tennis and the chairman of the All India Tennis Association. This is also an important fact. We have a man of extremely wide-ranging expertise and experience. So I'll pass the word over to Mr. Sinha, please.
You want me to say something?
Yes, for 5 minutes.
From there, here.
No, from here we all mic'd. So
wonderful. Well, I thought you will finish with the introduction.
No, I'll introduce each of you as we go. Sorry.
No, thank you. Before we start talking about is the party over, what is it? Is the story over? Is the party over?
Is the party over?
Is the party over? And then talk about planning, growth, and reforms. I would like you to first understand how did the party begin and why did the party begin. I mean, I'm surprised that very few people have really gone into the question of why did India start growing so fast suddenly, and why it has now stopped growing so fast. To my mind, we started growing very fast because, one, we unleashed the suppressed domestic demand. And there is a lot of suppressed domestic demand in India. Even today, I am not merely referring to consumption demand, I am also referring to demand of the investment kind, like infrastructure, etc. So it was the unleashing of the demand, domestic demand. The second was a very pleasant but surprising thing which happened, and that was that domestic savings in India started going up, and there was a peak of something like 36.8 or so that we reached by about 2008, and it was this which enabled India to have total aggregated investment, aggregated to as a percentage of the GDP of something like in excess of 38% in the best year. Now, this money which came into the financial sector and became available for all kinds of sectors, that was the reason why the corporates started borrowing. There was enough money to go around. And thirdly, we, as a measure of very deliberate policy, started moderating interest rates. And from something like a peak of 14% or so, it was ultimately brought down to about 6% a whopping reduction of 8%. And it was a combination of these three major factors: unleashing of demand, the second was easy availability of liquidity in the market, and the third was at an affordable cost. This is the background of the India story. And then we saw the kind of growth rates that we saw from 2003 onwards. And then we had the financial crisis here, that had an impact, and other things happened. I will not go into the details of that. But many of these things were undone. Many of these things were undone. And because high inflation has afflicted our economy, which I regard as the central issue in the economy today, because it's not merely taxation without representation, as they say, but it is also something which affects every Indian, especially the common man. So inflation has been raising, or had raised its ugly head more than 3 years ago, and we have not been able to get the better of it. As a result of that, the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, the Central Bank of India, has raised interest rates 13 times. Last time was the first time when they reduced it. And interest rates are still very high. The liquidity part is being handled a little more liberally now over the last few months. But there was a liquidity squeeze also, high interest rates, which made investments less attractive. And all this affected sentiment of the investor, of the consumer. And sentiment today in any economy plays a very, very important role. Sentiment is down. Now, is the party over? And I am not saying it here. I have said it in Lok Sabha, which I am a member, that the party is far from over. Because the India story will only go forward. It will have small little problems here and there, sometimes contributed by global factors, sometimes contributed by maybe whatever you might like to call it, inertia at home. But the secular trend of faster growth is something which is going to stay with us. Gone are the days when Indians would have put up with 3.5% or even 6%. The new normal is 8%, and anything less than that appears to be a disaster. And therefore, any government will have to act, fast in order to put together the story. And I like to tell you, because I represent a constituency from a very backward part of the country, that people are not today prepared to wait. They are in a hurry. They are in a hurry because many of their basic demands have not yet been met. And therefore, they are not going to forgive any government which does not pay attention to resolving their issues. And that is the direction in which we'll move, and that is the direction which will, as I said, unlock a lot of opportunities for the economy. And the rural sector is going to play an increasingly more important role, because that is where the market is, that is where the money is, and that is where the demand will come from. So therefore, I'm absolutely optimistic that the Indian story is far from over. There are some temporary problems which I'm sure we'll overcome as a nation, and we'll move forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. This is.
I'll go last. Yechury.
Yes, of course. Now I'm going to present each of you before you speak. So yes.
No, we're only getting a little worried as to who you'd present now. So
No. Sorry. In the order that you sit.
Okay.
That's why I was making sure you were
sitting
sitting like this. Okay. So the next speaker is Sitaram Yechury, who is representing the Communist Party of India, Marxist. I should say that I found out this morning actually that the founder, illustrious founder of India's Communist Party, was a Stanford alum. So we are the sort of beginning of the Communist Party of India, the very site here. Anyway, Sri Yechury is an economist by training from JNU and has had a long career in left politics, has been involved in student politics and so on, was elected a member of the Rajya Sabha from West Bengal in 2005 and is currently serving his second term as that. He is also a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and he also puts on his CV that he is one of the few Indian leaders to have met legendary figures like Fidel Castro, Yasser Arafat, and Nelson Mandela, and so on and so forth. We are very pleased to have Sri Yechury back here. He was also here last year, so please, the word is yours for about 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen, and my distinguished colleagues in the panel, Mr. Yashwant, Sinha and N.K. Singh. Though I'd actually wanted to speak after N.K. Singh, but then I mean, that's always a quarrel. I mean, who will remember? But then, is the party over? That's what I mean. I thought this was more of an interactive session, therefore I'm not going into all the issues. Well, as Mr. Sinha said, the party is far from over. But what is happening right now is that in some corners of a large party, I mean, there are squabbles going on. There's some people may get into some fights, but the most important thing is the host himself or herself is not really sure on the menu that is going to be served for the dinner, and that is the problem with the reform process in India, because right now you have a situation of, let's say, knee-jerk reactions, fits and starts. Washington Post says something of the Prime Minister, and he reacts, opens up the retail trade for FDI, and then says the states will decide. And of the 40-odd cities with more than 10 million population, where the FDI is supposed to come, only 19 are there in Congress ruled states. The rest won't. And this itself puts in an uncertainty, and therefore very unlikely that there is going to be any flow of capital that will come in until the matters are decided, because we are going in for a general election soon, 2014. So the new government, whether it will continue with this or not, because currently Mr. Yashwant Sinha and I are on the same side opposing it, or party-wise, party-wise. So there are lots of uncertainties that are there, but the basic point, I think, if you really want to discuss the question of reforms in the future of India, on the future of India, when there would be a unanimity that it can only be an optimistic future. But the question is, how fast or how slowly will we realize our potential? The issue about the reforms is the pace in which we will be able to realize our potential, and not really whether you're for or against. There are some reforms will be against, there will be some reforms will be for, because eventually reforms have to be judged by saying that what will they deliver. And this, I think, the fundamental issue that we must realize is that there is a battle of ideas on two paths for the reform. One current path, and which has been the path that's been there, dominant in this period for the last 2 decades of globalization that's been going on, is the part that is directed and coordinated and led by finance. International finance, and therefore sentiment becomes important, whether that finance will flow or not. With the flow of international finance, we can enlarge investments in India, and investments enlargement in India is going to lead to greater employment, and therefore to greater growth and employment, and therefore to greater prosperity. I mean, that is, to put it in a nutshell, that is the theoretical justification. The other part, which we all represent, is that investment flows by themselves cannot translate into higher growth unless what is produced by that investment is able to be consumed by the Indian economy, which is your aggregate domestic demand. Now, the aggregate domestic demand in India, if not stagnating, is actually on the decline because of the price rise, which is spoken of for the last 3 years. So, given this fact, just pumping in investment or making capital, access to capital easier or cheaper in terms of lower interest rates alone will not lead to the trajectory of a higher growth rate, unless you're able to simultaneously also bring in reforms that will be able to enlarge your aggregate domestic demand. And unless you are able to converge these two, your growth story will continue to falter and will continue to stagnate. And that is where our point of view comes in, saying that right now the emphasis seems to be in how to attract greater international finance and capital flows into India. And therefore the recent slew of measures that have been announced. Now this, but our critique is that this by itself will not help India unless you are able to enlarge your domestic demand, for which there is no dearth of resources. I mean, we discussed corruption last year, and I think what all we said, at least what all I said on this platform, has only been vindicated in the course of this year. I mean, you had mega scams that have been coming out. We discussed crony capitalism last year. I'm not going to repeat repeat all those points. But then you have a siphoning off of resources, a mega amount of resources through these scams. Those are otherwise available for state-sponsored infrastructural development and investment. That can generate a large amount of employment and therefore also enlarge your domestic demand. On the other hand, in order to, I would say, appease or create a good sentiment for finance to flow through, international finance to flow through, there have been a slew of tax concessions that have been given in order to attract this investment. Now, the tax concessions in India, I mean, this is a very strange figure. I mean, if you actually go through our budget figures for the current year, the tax concessions that were given in the last fiscal year in India were to the tune of 5.28 lakh crores. In US terminology, that will come to about 5.28 billion rupees. The fiscal deficit of India, which is 6.9, and every one of us is very worried. I mean, why is it going up? There is a need for fiscal discipline, consolidation, etc., etc. Very correct. But how much does 6.9% of our GDP translate to? 5.22 lakh crore. That is 5.22 billion. So if you give tax concessions that are larger than your fiscal deficit, with the hope of capital inflows that will come in, that will be able to increase investments, which will reduce our fiscal deficit, and therefore concern over containing fiscal deficit means another round of hikes in prices of various essential commodities, and we had a round with diesel, etc. And that is going to further shrink your domestic demand. So this is the battle of the reform story in India. Is it an automatic route that you attract investments? You attract the flow of foreign capital, either FDI or FII, and that will lead to an automatic higher growth trajectory. On the other side is the picture that cannot lead to a higher trajectory, sustainable higher trajectory, unless you are able to simultaneously tackle the issue of enlarging aggregate domestic demand. So there are no dearth of resources in India. If you are able to stop this crony capitalist loot, if you are able to contain the slew of tax concessions, there's enough resources available for building the much needed infrastructure. We are still woeful in terms of infrastructure, I mean, in all dimensions. And NK has written a paper on it. He says he'll present it day after tomorrow. But I don't want to get into that area. But we have enough resources. So the question is, which direction will this reform process take?
Okay.
And that is going to be a battle not merely in terms of the actual reforms that will be introduced, but it will also have a reflection in the political battle, because after all, eventually, in India, like elsewhere, is the story of political economy. I mean, now how that will happen. So there are things in the margin which appear to be exaggeratedly real, that there are coalition problems, therefore the government is being handicapped to take decisions, etc. That really, honestly, that's never been a problem. The government is determined to go ahead, it can go ahead. I mean, there were coalition problems, yeah. Coalition problems when we were not supporting the nuclear deal, but they went ahead. Nobody could stop it. So that is only a story, I mean, which is an excuse, I mean, not really the reality. And therefore, I think the right mix of these reforms is what India needs to carry the party, to keep the party on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. So our third presenter is also a frequent visitor to Stanford, Sri N.K. Singh, who is currently the member of Rajya Sabha and from the state of Bihar. He's also had an illustrious career in civil services, in many held many different posts in finance, in economic affairs, revenue secretary. He's been in the Ministry of Home Affairs and so on. He's also been involved in the work of the United Nations, has represented India in delegations to the World Bank, IMF, and so on and so forth. He's also an economist by training and is a member of the Public Accounts Committee and the Committee on Public Undertakings, the Standing Committee on Education, and other committees in the Indian Parliament. So it's a great pleasure to have you here again. Please, 5 minutes on this very large question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hansen. The broad overarching question, as a question you framed, was, is the party over? I mean, in any party, clearly there are a set of people who want to go home early. There are others who want to stay on for a little longer. Now, the comedy is that usually these are people who are married and are wondering whether to have a divorce or not. So I think that if you look at the Indian reform story, broadly the reformers and the anti-reformers in some form or the other are linked in this broad spectrum of an arrangement or whether to go back early or whether to hang on for it. And also I think that as it says that no party is ever, Mr. Hansen, complete without a woman. Now it's for us to decide whether a woman is a critical factor in any party. And this is primarily because no party is ever interesting unless it is seasoned with a bit of folly. So I think that the issue would be that has the Indian reform story in some way fallen a prey to the folly with which no party is ever interesting. I tend to agree with the broad drift of Mr. Sinha's remarks and some parts of Mr. Yechury's remarks to say that if you look at the Indian reform story of 1991 that it began, and earlier to that, of course, we grew at a much slower rate of growth. We hastened up the rate of growth in 1991. The jury is out or whether it was an act of conscious choice or it was the inevitable consequence of a crisis which came upon us. Did it do it out of conviction or did we do it out of compulsion? So I think that the jury is still out on that, on why we really made the fundamental shift. But whatever it is, the fact remains that growth rates jacked up, savings rate went up, the macroeconomic stability was firmly in place, fiscal deficits were reined in, large parts of the economy were really begun to open up to private sector and to foreign capital. Now, I think that the crescendo of all this, one particular factor I'd like to definitely mention before I transit to the next issue is that there have been 4 or 5 successive governments which have come after 1991. And none of the governments upturned what had happened and what commenced in 1991. So I think that there is therefore a broad degree of continuity in what happened. Now, why has this suddenly, after reaching a very high rate of growth of 8.5%, India being toasted on all the high tables of the world, and therefore the party continuing, India being toasted to all the high tables of the world, viewed as an important BRIC country, viewed as an economic superpower about to come to the global stage, is that part over? Has the I in the BRIC dropped out? Have the people relegated us from the high table to the middle table? That's the question you asked, Mr. Hansen. Now, why has that happened? I think it has happened due to 3 factors, some of which, of course, Mr. Sinha very eloquently pointed out. The fact remains that macroeconomic stability has come into serious question. You cannot have a fiscal deficit which is unsustainable along with a current account deficit which is also unsustainable. The Reserve Bank of India, like all reserve banks, have the job of managing an impossible trinity, the trinity of an open capital account, along with interest rates which are flexible, and managing inflation in a credible way. The choice between growth versus inflation and what form of growth remains an important unaddressed issue. So the first kernel is putting macroeconomic stability back in place. The second thing that happened, unfortunately, was why did investor confidence in India suddenly become shaken up? What did we do so wrong? Well, I traveled all over the world. My good friend Lawrence Summers and Laura Tyson, who is right here in San Francisco, perhaps in Berkeley, she told me 2 months ago that you Indians did two things wrong. First, Larry Summers told me that you Indians went about the world selling this pop that, you know, India believes in the rule of law. And then what did you do? You changed that rule of law just to penalize one particular company. You altered your income tax laws retrospectively for 20 years to undo that judgment. How do you expect the world to believe that India believes in the rule of law? This has nothing to do with exogenous factors. This is we ourselves shooting ourselves in the foot. We put together a set of tax policies which are clearly, India cannot be a tax haven, fair enough. But when an investor looks at the matrix of where to go, whether to go to India, whether to go to Philippines, he looks at a congregation of factors. And tax regime is also one of the factors. So I think that we ourselves are responsible for shooting down investor confidence, which has altered capital flows. Third and foremost, the India growth story shifted from the center to the states. As the center became weak, propelled by the compulsions of coalition politics, as survival became an end in itself and not a means to an end to catapult the India growth story, then the story of India came to states. Mr. Yashwant Sinha and I, we have the privilege of coming from the same state. One of the good examples of what governance can do to improve the factors of production, to influence economic growth, is the state from where both of us come from, the state of Bihar, which last year registered a modest growth of only 16% and an average growth of 11.8%. That's about twice the rate of growth that India may have experienced during this time if we look at last year's economic growth. So I think that the story shifted to the growth. Now, what do we intend to do in the future? I think that I'll take 1 minute to say that. First, I think clearly there is no escape from the fact that you need to restore macroeconomic stability. And so the steps that Mr. Sinha mentioned are dead on target. We need to do that. Second, for the reasons that Mr. Yechury pointed out very correctly, that it's not merely consumption, but the fact of our recognizing that the asymmetry of demography gives us an advantage. In what way? A huge unsaturated consumption in India, a huge unsaturated consumption in many parts of Southeast Asia, which still remains the largest home of the maximum number of poor people. There's a huge unsaturated demand. Prospects, therefore, of investment in India, in human resource development, in education, and in infrastructure, which enables us to derive the advantage of this demographic differential, as large parts of the world, including China, have begun to gray and where wage rates have begun to creep up. But it won't happen automatically, because as many of us know, the whole Indian garment industry has shifted out of India to Bangladesh. If you have labor policies and labor regulations, which have 43 labor regulations in the central government and 57 labor regulations in other parts of India, then clearly we are losing the comparative factor advantage of what really the increased supply side elasticity at affordable competitive cost, the labor factor advantage gives to us. So really speaking, working on that comparative factor advantages. And finally, because both exports and investment are really, we have to work in a competitive world, how to make India's as an investment destination, which is superior to many countries, which really are also targeting for that same investment to be able to garner it, and what policies would enable this to happen. Is the India party over? The party has scarcely begun. There is still a debate going on. I agree with Sitaram that the issue is not whether after the soup, the main course will come or not. What kind of a main course would it be? And would it be a happy dessert ending? That is the story. India growth story remains intact. I'm not only optimistic, but indeed, I'm sanguine that this party will go on for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much for these very interesting inputs and presentations. The floor is open. When you ask your question, would you please say who you are and where you come from? And if you want to direct your question to one of the speakers in particular or to the panel as such. So, yes. There's a mic coming, yeah, right.
Karsten Holz, I'm visiting SCIET. I'm a scholar on China, working on China. So I was struck by the similarities between what you were doing in India and what China did. The unleashing of suppressed demand, that's what China did in the beginning. The low interest rate, high savings, high investment, that's what China did. The 8% growth rate, that's exactly what China postulates as its target. Developing rural areas, it's the same. Exporting, attracting foreign direct investment. But there's one difference. In China, it's the local governments which have incentives to develop the local economy. If these local governors promote economic growth, they get promoted to a higher level job. And I'm wondering about India. How does that work? Do the local governments have incentives for growth? Or is it just the central government that promotes economic growth? What do they gain, the local governments, from growth?
Okay, thank you very much. Reaction? We can take a couple of questions, yeah. So we have a little more to go on. Other hands? I see a hand down there, yes?
Yeah, just to follow up to that, because same question. We talk about here in the US that we have 51 democratic experiments in every state. Can we do the same thing? You mentioned Bihar was doing extremely well. Gujarat is doing extremely well. Can we overcome the paralysis in the central government by the regional governments doing a great job and compensating for, just like John was saying, in China, the city mayors are able to make concessions and create jobs and create opportunities and invite investment independent of whatever the central government does.
Thank you. We take one more question. Vivek, here? Yeah.
So I'm Vivek. I work with the Program on Liberation Technology here at Stanford. So we've definitely heard a lot about how to improve the investment climate and so on with very large corporations. What are your thoughts on the opportunity for the smaller person?
All right. Thank you. Reactions? Mr. Sinha?
Well, you know, with regard to the role of the central government and the role of the states, I think Mr. N.K. Singh has told you how the states are now moving forward and how the story has become a joint effort between the government of India and the state governments. But there are, under our constitution, certain areas which are the sole responsibility of the government of India, and that is where the government of India must move. And then, in most parts, the implementation of the policies, whether framed at the level of the government of India or at the state level, is the responsibility of the state governments. And it is this arrangement where the funds are flowing from the federal government to the state governments. State governments may have some resources of their own, and they have now to get translated into action on the ground. This is where the leadership at the state level becomes very important and plays a crucial role. This was not what it was like, let's say 20 years, 30 years ago in India. And therefore it was the government of India, the central government, which used to dominate. Now it's reversing. And it is the state governments which are making their own efforts and are coming forward. You mentioned the example of China. Unfortunately, we don't have the Chinese system where promotions can be assured from the state to the center. But I'd like to tell you that amongst the most publicized claimants to the post of the Prime Minister of India the next time are state chief ministers, not the leaders who are working at Delhi, but state chief ministers who have done extremely well in their respective states, and two of them have been mentioned just now. That's the kind of competition that we are seeing. So in our democracy, promotion will come automatically with performance, and performance is something which people are recognizing. So it is now very important that the states are given a much bigger role in our polity, and the federal principle, which has always been under some kind of strain from time to time, is now getting very firmly established, and the states are going to play an increasingly important role.
Thank you. Mr. Yechury?
Well, I think the role of the states is undeniable. I mean, all of us have, I think irrespective of the parties we come from, we always talk of strengthening India's federal structure. The role of the states must be more important, and they should be given a greater role. But even in China, what you've said is correct about the local governments, local initiatives they take. But the macroeconomic parameters are set by the central government. Now, unless these parameters are set by the central government, no local government can be able to take advantage of it. So it is the setting of the macroeconomic parameters, I mean, that is very important, even if you allow for decentralization of decision making. Now, that is where the problem comes in here. If you have a paralysis in setting the macroeconomic parameters, any amount of initiative you give to the states will not work unless these parameters are set. In China, how did they tackle the global financial meltdown? The entire stimulus in China went into expanding your domestic demand. And these were decisions taken by the central authority. Your interest rates, the amount of investments, in which area you're going in, and then leave it to the local areas to promote that. So that is the synergy that's required. Now, you cannot have them separated. And India as well is going to be, I mean, that is what is evolving. I mean, if it is said that the growth story is moved from the center to the states, it is moved as a process of the maturation of the Indian federal system as well. So you'll have to have an important say for the states. I won't say equal say, because in our constitutional structure, and I think in some parts rightly so, because the central parameters have to be fixed by the central government. Once they are fixed, then the states have the role to play. And this is where again your question comes in, Vivek. The question of, I mean, what do you do with the small players? Again, the parameters have to be set by the center. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I also think the small players have a very big role in India particularly. I mean, we only keep looking at the large dimensions of who's coming in for a large level of investments. But the small players will have a very important role to play. And of course, that would also mean for the states to rethink on some of the regulations that they have. Otherwise, the small players will not be attracted. So both center and the states will have to work together. And I think that is the story of the Chinese experience as well. And it'll be a different form in India, naturally, as I said. But it has to be a synergy between the two.
Thank you very much. NK?
I think that most of the points I wanted to make have been covered. Let me put it somewhat differently to you. The Indian Constitution, when it was framed, was said to be a federal constitution, but with a centrist bias. And the Constitution, therefore, has in three parts. Is part one on subjects which belong to the central government, part two which belong to the state government, and part three which belongs to the concurrent list of subjects on which both the state and the center can really take decisions. Now, this is the asymmetry, what time of 60 years of experience has taught us. Political power, by factors whatever they may be, have devolved increasingly to states. States have become more powerful. Regional parties have become more powerful. A coalition government brings the importance of regional parties in decision-making process of the central government. Now, whereas it has happened in the case not consciously, it has happened really on account of factors which were not perhaps conceived of. Political power has gone increasingly to states. Economic power has remained by and large with the central government. Let me give you a classic example. It is very true, my friend Mr. Yechury pointed out, that the parameters have to be set by the central government. But here is the asymmetry. take a very important aspect of the macroeconomic parameter, which per se, Mr. Yechury mentioned, that the macro parameters have to be set by the central government. Take the most critical macroeconomic parameter, namely the acceptable levels of fiscal deficit. Now, what has really happened is that both the central government and the state governments enacted the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act. Indeed, the state governments were advised to do so, to take advantage of certain debt restructuring and profile, which would be available to them only if they altered this act. Therefore, both the central and the state governments both enacted the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act. The central government has breached it repeatedly. First, it wanted to have a pause button. Second, it wanted to reset the targets. And third, it wanted to have a revised map of the fiscal consolidation process. The states not only have implemented, have fully adhered, little or no flexibility to give. So it is true that the umpire must set the rules of the game. But it would be ironic that if in setting the rules of the game, the umpire chose a different set of rules for the central government than the umpire chose it for the states to enact. Yes, power has devolved to state governments. I entirely agree with Mr. Sinha that good governance has become a touchstone in which voters begin to reflect the choice of voting parameters. That in large number of states of India, which had been driven by identity politics, electoral outcomes of governments being repeated is on account of better development metrics than adherence to identity politics alone. And only those state governments which have combined better life quality for their people with a clever coalition also of identity politics have been re-elected and re-elected, holding the prospect of further election. So I think that the state governments have really begun to demonstrate a capability of not being a drag on India's economy, but being an important contributor to the India growth story. Last comment on the small and medium industries. Yes, I agree, but then foreign investment is not something which is driven by a fiat. Foreign investments have to find investments in small and medium to be attractive enough to be able to come in. What kind of policies of the central government would enable them to become more attractive in terms of technology, in terms of availability of finance, in terms of a set of rules and regulations which are somewhat more preferentially tilted, is something which I think needs further consideration.
Thank you very much. Let's take another round of questions. We have a couple of hands down here. Yes? Just wait for the mic if you don't mind. Thank you.
I was wondering if Mr. Singh has the same view as Mr. Yechury about the effect of the multi-brand retail on the whole investment flow from foreign companies, because as you pointed out, part of it is a matter of what the image India proposes. As Summers told you about the rule of law, wouldn't there be a residual effect in at least starting to reverse the foreign investment trend, even if it doesn't amount to a huge amount of money by the multi-retail industry?
Thanks. There was one over there. Yeah, the blue shirt.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank SID and Saiper and Roshan Shankar for introducing us to this event. I'm a management science and engineering student. I have a question for actually each of the panelists. First of all, I'm really glad that all of you all think so positively about India. It's really heartening to see. Mr. Sinha, my question for you is, you were saying that a lot of investment came into India when when we realized the purchasing power was there with the Indians. I feel a lot of it was driven towards consumable goods rather than the basic infrastructure. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Mr. Yechury, I'd like to ask you, you're talking about a difference between central and state government. I'd like to see what you think about reforms in urban versus rural areas. What should the distribution be like? Should it be driven by the state governments or central governments? And finally, sir, as an economist, I want to ask you, there are a lot of times we've seen over the last 20 years in India that a lot of events have been, to an economist, they'd be quite shocking. say, for example, the 92 riots or, the reactions to cricket losses or, to scenes in movies. Do you feel India is ready to move on an economic-based path, or, are passions still quite integral to India?
Okay, thank you. One more question, Mr. Kumar here. Yes.
Actually, I want to pick up on a comment that NK made relating to the Vodafone case. The question is that as members of parliament, how do you view a couple of issues? One is, there's this parliament versus Supreme Court situation, where Supreme Court comes up with a decision, and then we pick on that one area and say we're going to retroactively change the law with 50 years retroactive effect. So is that a healthy thing in a democracy where, the Supreme Court has made a decision? Is it a big enough decision to take on the Supreme Court? The second is, what's your thought about the impression that it creates in the rest of the world, in the investing community? I think your view was very clear. But what do members of parliament think about that? Or is that a factor at all in the decision-making process?
Thank you very much. Mr. Sinha?
Well, I'll take on this question which has been addressed to me about consumption demand versus investment demand. I must confess that I am not a trained economist like my two colleagues, but I'll still attempt to answer this. In every economy, both kinds of demands have to be balanced at every point of time. And the economy will progress if the balance is right. The point I'm making is, in the last few years, this balance has been upset because with all the fiscal space that we created, we encouraged the consumption demand rather than the investment demand. And that's why you have had problems on the supply side, which has led to inflation. And this is what our Prime Minister said in a recent speech to the nation, that if you have large fiscal deficit, then it will lead to large demands, creation of demand, and large demand will put pressure on prices, etc. That's a given. That is why when we were in government, we made sure that while on the one hand the consumption demand was unlocked, the investment demand also was equally encouraged. And all the measures that we adopted, including the famous road building projects, for instance, were to unlock the investment demand. Housing is somewhere something which sits on in the center. It is a consumption demand because consumers go and buy houses, and it also unlocks a lot of investment demand. So housing was something which we encouraged through a series of measures, and it's one of the untold stories of India, how housing revolution was started and how it has achieved great success in our country. And when I was talking to you about unleashing demand, for instance, the housing sector was one area which was uppermost in my mind, because many of our people, especially in the rural areas, still don't have houses. In the urban areas, also, they don't have adequate housing. So housing is something which, if encouraged, is going to have such a multiplier effect on economic development alone, that one sector, that it will take care of a lot of our problems. Which was the second one which was addressed to me just now? Somebody said you mentioned about Mr. Kumar. The Vodafone case. My view is very clear. My view is there is the authority vested in the Parliament of India to even undo a Supreme Court judgment, and this is something which has been done in the past. I, as finance minister, would have done it a number of times, that there is a Supreme Court judgment and we are undoing it by legislation. In the division of power, Parliament is supreme and we can undo a judgment of the Supreme Court. Second, coming to the specific case of Vodafone, the demand raised was right, that there was capital gains and that capital gains should be taxed under our law. And I think the then finance minister, who is now our respected Rashtrapati, he was quite right in saying that we are not a tax haven country, and therefore we are entitled to raise that demand. The company went to Supreme Court in its wisdom passed a judgment, the government went in a review with a review petition. That review petition also was rejected. But you'll be surprised to know that despite all this, now the two parties are negotiating. And when I left India, I was reading a newspaper report that Vodafone is quite willing to pay the tax raised minus the interest and the penalty. So they know that they are not completely in the right. Supreme Court judgment or no Supreme Court judgment, they know they are not fully in the right. It sent a very adverse signal abroad, you know. But I think it will be wrong to relate it to the whole question of rule of law in India. That this one particular case, and this is the crucial mistake that we make. We just pick up one case and judge the whole country by that one case. It will be wrong to make a judgment of this kind, and I'm sure government in its wisdom will settle the Vodafone case.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Yeah,
Yechury.
thank you. On the GAR issue, I think he said everything that needs to be said.
No, GAR is different.
No, GAR is different. No.
GAR is different.
On Vodafone.
Vodafone, I was dealing only with Vodafone. On GAR, on GAR the story is different.
Yes.
You know, when I was introduced, it was mentioned that I also chair the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance. And this Direct Access Code Bill, which was introduced after long years of gestation, was sent to us for examination. And as you know, the Standing Committee of Parliament is an all-party committee. And we studied it, examined it, took all the evidence of all the stakeholders, finally gave our report. And I told the then finance minister, when I saw the GAR chapter in his budget speech and in the finance bill, I told him in Lok Sabha when I was speaking on the finance bill, I said, you had our report. You could have said in your budget speech, as you indeed did, that you have received the report of the Standing Committee on Finance, that you will examine it expeditiously and come back to Parliament with your considered views, instead of introducing the most controversial of all chapters in the Direct Access Code Bill, namely the GAR chapter. Then he did not assure us in give us the assurance in Lok Sabha,
but he gave it
but
to
he
us.
gave it in the Rajya Sabha, that the GAR will be
reviewed.
It will be reviewed, not implemented, from 1st April 2012. Then they appointed, and this is a very, very peculiar thing that they have done, that the issue has been examined by the government, by the Standing Committee of Parliament, it is pending with the government. Now they have appointed another committee to examine it. And then the finance minister comes out with, and that committee has recommended it should be kept in the cold storage for 3 years.
Frozen for 3 years.
Frozen for 3 years. And the finance minister appears to be in no hurry to implement it. So there you are. You never know where you are with this government.
On that note, Mr. Yechury.
Well, there have been some substantive questions that have been raised, which I'd like to deal. But when you talk of, I think, who raised the issue of passions in India?
The gentleman over here.
Gentleman out there. I mean, India itself is a passion, you see. And unless you have the passion, you can't conceive of India as what it is. I mean the
argumentative India,
or the idea of India. I mean, it is full of passion. So passion is going to be an element you cannot wish away. But it should not be the wrong type of passions. I mean, which unfortunately have been growing of late. I mean, that is something that we'll have to tackle. I mean, there are all types of things that are happening. You had the Bodoland thing in Assam. I mean, it's had an effect all over the place. Well, that's a different story. But these are problems that are integral to India, and we'll have to handle it. So you cannot wish it away, but we'll have to really tackle it. But your most substantive thing on the question of unleashing domestic demand only through consumption thing and having neglected the infrastructure development and investment. You see, I wouldn't really say that they were neglected. When they were in government, when they did that, I mean, Enron is one classic example. I mean, what happened, I mean, it is not really an isolated example. But why is international capital less willing to come into infrastructure investments? You see, infrastructure investments have, compared to investments in consumption sectors, have a long gestation lag for your profit generation. And if you want to make it attractive, then there have to be a slew of very, very strong concessions that you'll have to grant them. And given those concessions, given this long gestation lag, is it worth the while for that investment to come? Now, believe you me, in every country, all through experience, whether it's the United States of America or is the People's Republic of China, the state has been the primary player in building the infrastructure. Private capital can only come as a complement. And you cannot really abandon the state's role in doing that. If the state picks it up, like you mentioned the roads, or you will something else, yes, I mean, private capital can be attracted. But that cannot be in terms of policy of attracting private capital. I mean, that itself will not work. You'll have to make the dynamics more, more easier for it to work. But the question of the Supreme Court judgment and the Vodafone thing. But sir, remember, Supreme Court in India or the thing, they can interpret the law. It's the Parliament alone that can make the law. And that is a very important distinction. That is the most important issue that you must keep in mind. And the question of retail trade issue that I think you raised, or are you? Okay. You see, I mean, I'm not sure how much it will go to reverse the sentiment. I mean, if it is meant only as more of assuaging a hurt sentiment, I mean, maybe it can work. Yes, India is very keen on it, but it is not going to materialize itself, in my reckoning, into any large flow of capital to India. I mean, we have our reasons why we are opposing this. I mean, we think it will lead to a large-scale reduction in employment in that area. And nearly a fifth of India's population is living on retail trade. I mean, there are other social problems that will emerge of this. We don't think it's wise to go in now. Because of two problems, this inflow will not come. One is, as I explained while I was speaking, that the decision has been left to the state governments. And for a population of cities with a population of 10 million, right? Was that the decision? And there are only 19 cities in those areas where the Congress is in, or their allies are in power today. In 36 out of them, I mean, there are opposition parties who have opposed this. Now, if they are not going to allow them in their states, I mean, who is going to come in? Uncertainty is there. So, I mean, I don't think this will actually translate itself into material flow of investments. But maybe, if you so think so here, that there has to be, it may have positively affected the sentiment. Finally, there's this question about rural versus urban that you have talked about. I mean, where does it, you see, rural India and Indian agriculture require a huge degree of reform in terms of greater investments that are required to actually upgrade our agricultural sector. It will be foolish to think that India can actually go on neglecting agriculture. And that will be the biggest millstone around Indian economy's neck and its growth story. And unfortunately, that sort of investments have not been coming. 60 years down the line since independence, still 4/5, or maybe we are, I mean, if you're trying to be more complimentary, but 2/3 of Indian agriculture is dependent on the rains. Unless you have an investment, large-scale investment to improve and enlarge irrigation, and unless you improve agriculture, unless you improve a rural economy, the rest of the growth story gets limited. So that is where the state intervention is required. And since, I mean, which has not been said, since I had the parliamentary committee on infrastructure virtually, I mean, I have the shipping, I have the road transport, and I have the civil aviation. And tourism and culture. I mean, it's a huge, he's lucky, he just has one ministry. I've got 5 of them. I've got 5 of them. And dealing with all these things and looking at the nitty-gritties and the fine print in all the allegations that comes, there's a long, long way to go for India to really do a proper planning in terms of infrastructure. I mean, you really, I mean, I'm sure NK will, in the later session, will explain that more forcefully and eloquently because he's worked on it. But that is where I think, but otherwise you're right, the urban versus rural divide will only widen. And that will lead to other social problems of large-scale migration. And today there's no city in India where 2/3 of them are not living in the slums. And that is going to be the real social problem. And that maybe that's the right kind of passion that should come out by the slum people protesting against their livelihood, rather than fighting about ethnic or other issues. But that's a different thing. But this is an area that requires a lot of attention.
Thank you. NK?
Well, I'll be very brief. I think that the points have mostly been covered, so I'll address some of the very specific questions which were asked. First, I think that this question on multi-brand retail, and whether Sitaram, Yechury have the same views as I have. Indeed, Mr. Yashwant Sinha should have been included in that, because, but it will be taken for granted that since both of us belong to the same NDA configuration, we are likely to have the same views. Let me put it this way to you on the multi-brand retail. First, the jury is still out on whether the displacement of employment is larger than the creation of the likely new employment. And what is the net game out of that? Leaving that issue aside, the issue before the Prime Minister contextually was to react to a global critique that India had gone into a phase of policy paralysis. Was this the right measure? Or was this the key measure to signal to the rest of the world that India is back on the track of reforms? My answer to that is in the negative. Why? The reason is this, that if the purpose is to incentivize large inward capital flows, what are the measures which would have enabled foreign investors to bring in large capital flows to India? We suggest 3 for your consideration. First, the reform of India's pension bill. That's a bill on which Mr. Sinha, as the chairman of the parliamentary committee, had not only argued in favor of it, but the NDA had committed that we want to support the pension bill should you bring that to parliament. There are large pension funds waiting to see the India growth story. It would have come in automatically. There would have been no controversy on it. It would also have been a irreversible step. There is the issue of opening up of India's insurance sector. There is a strong bipartisan support on opening up of India's insurance sector. Policy which began, indeed, at the time of the NDA. And we would be willing to fortify and continue with that policy. There are the reforms of India's banking and financial sector. These have all strong bipartisan support and would have brought in large inward capital flows to substantially bridge the growing current account deficit, which is one of the most bothersome deficits in comparison along with the fiscal deficit in India. So my answer to that retail issue is a rhetorical one. On the gains of it, the jury is still out. But that was perhaps not the most critical step which would have been taken not only to bring in actual inward capital flows, but to signal to the international community that India was willing to accept large inward investments in some of the key sectors like pension, insurance, and financial sector reforms. On this issue of, for instance, consumption versus investment, I think that, the jury is to some extent still out on that one. One of the factors leading to the global financial meltdown, on which we have now got enough literature on it, is that China pursued a policy in which the emphasis was an investment-driven growth. India, on the other hand, pursued a policy which was too dominantly a consumption-driven growth. And therefore, the right kind of a balance in India's 12th five-year plan, and China has also embarked on its own 12th five-year plan, is for India to become increasingly more investment-driven growth and China to move to a more consumption-driven growth. So I think that the choice is not so much a choice of white and black. The choice is in different shades of gray in this. Both countries need both investment and consumption, but I think India needs to balance its consumption-driven growth with an investment-driven growth, and China should balance its investment-driven growth to a consumption-driven growth. That will be good for both India and China. It will also be good for a better balancing of the globe structural deficiencies which are featured as part of the malaise which led the globe into this difficulty. Last question on Vodafone. It's only a comment in passing. And that comment in passing is that there is, of course, no doubt that Parliament is a supreme entity which can enact any law prospectively, certainly, but even retrospectively. The question is not so much its powers, the question is its reasonableness. And what I suggest to this audience here is that when I was the Revenue Secretary of India, and there was a similar kind of a dispute which government had had in the case of another important multinational company, the ITC, and we had followed the way that the government is now intending to follow. Bring all stakeholders together and arrive at a reasonable negotiated settlement. That worked in the case of ITC. It could have worked in the case of Vodafone. And what the government is doing now, it could perhaps have done earlier without bringing into an international space and domain a controversy which has served nobody very well.
Thank you very much. Just as I was about to implement preferential treatment for female questioners, question from female members of the, there was a couple of hands coming up here. Yes, here.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm a student at Stanford and a Sloan Fellow at the Business School. We've heard a lot about investment-driven growth, consumption-driven growth, state-led investment in state directives for growth. But here we're sitting in the Silicon Valley, and if you look at economic history, both short-term and over the last century or 2 centuries, you've typically seen growth really driven by technology, by entrepreneurship, by small and medium companies, not large incumbents like Reliance or Tata. And you see the opportunities sometimes for nations when they grow to actually leapfrog other nations as they grow, using technology, using innovation, and using domestic, organic innovation and entrepreneurship. Could you comment on that?
Thank you very much. There's a question down here.
Hi, Kavita Kannan from Stanford Change Labs. My question is really more philosophical than anything else, but we look at the parliament as the most powerful boardroom in the country, making life-altering decisions for the nation. And we look at that in the context of the paralysis that we've seen in the recent past. It's good that we have a platform for dissent and debate, but when that reaches a point of paralysis where people at the bottom of the pyramid don't really have an opportunity to engage in the party, given that the theme for this conversation is the party over, I wonder if it would be of merit to actually consider an alternative form of democracy. I mean, our system is essentially rooted and was born out of the colonial past that we had. And I wonder if it would make sense for us to consider an alternative form of democracy as an evolutionary process in our democratic path, in a way that we can have more people from the bottom of the pyramid. I mean, it's a pity that after 60 years of independent governance, we still have 2/3 of the people living in poverty. And it's a pity that 45% of our children are malnourished. So I wonder if it's the right time for us to consider an alternative system. It's a long journey, but do you think that this is the right time to think about an alternative form? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. There was one more down here. Yes? Yeah. Sorry.
Hi.
We only take 3 at a time.
Hi, my name is Anu Mandavili, and I'm with the Friends of South Asia. I wanted to sort of go back to the question of the rule of law, which has been invoked a couple of times today. I have been following, along with a bunch of other friends, the progress of the POSCO project in Orissa. And it has been distressing to see that a series of laws, fairly important ones, the Forest Rights Act, the Environmental Impact Assessment Act, the Coastal Zone Regulation Act, in fact, constitutional mandates about the Panchayati Raj, about, local self-determination, have been roundly violated time and time again. And, the people have been resisting for 7 years. It's been very clear. I mean, there's no ambiguity about what they want. I'm just wondering, what needs to change the political climate where, rule of law is in fact respected, and that can in fact inspire the confidence of people of India themselves, not necessarily external investors. So it's a very distressing question to me, so I hope we have a good discussion about it. Thanks.
Thank you. In the view of time that we're running out of time, maybe we should take one more question here and then have the last round of responses, because we're coming up to 2 o'clock, unfortunately. I'm sure we could go on for much longer. Please.
Hi, Maithili Sankaran with the US-India Business Council. Many prominent Indian legal firms have set up thriving practices in Silicon Valley and in foreign soil. However, India has closed its doors to foreign legal firms opening up office in India. I'd love to hear your thoughts for or against this stance.
Okay. Thank you. I think we will begin with Mr. Sinha, with these 4 quite different issues.
I couldn't get the last one.
Foreign law firms.
Foreign law firms.
Foreign law firms.
Well, in response to the first question on technology and innovation, you're quite right. I mean, we happen to veer in that direction, and that's why we did not talk about growth led by technology and innovation. But, this is a very valid point that you made, that it is not merely consumption and investment. It is, innovation and technology helps in pushing both investment demand as well as consumption demand. So, and especially in consumption, the obsolescence factor. I mean, there is a product in the market today and tomorrow it's obsolete. So here, it does play a very important role, and every country which wants to make progress will have to be fully conscious of both technology and innovation. And I dare say that in our case, we have done a lot to encourage both technology and innovation. On the question of whether we can experiment with another form of democracy, this is a question which has been debated, but I think we are quite comfortable the way we are going. And there was a time, personally for me, when I thought the presidential system was better than the parliamentary system that we have. But on second thought, I think, let's be the way we are. And it is not merely that, it is on an academic plane that we are discussing whether this is better or that is better. On a practical plane, I can tell you that any major change in the Constitution is something which is not possible, will not be acceptable. So we can think of innovations and improvements in the present system, but a change, complete shift to another system, not practical. POSCO has run into all kinds of problems, and there are laws and there are issues which have to be taken into account. I am not a votary of foreign investment at any cost. And when I was talking to you about India's domestic investment driving our growth, I could have mentioned to you that if you look at our total investment, it has consistently, foreign investment of all kinds, has been over the last many years, been about, 2% of our GDP?
Never.
That's all. So if you have 36% coming from domestic sources and 2% coming from foreign sources, then all this hullabaloo that we are making and that concentration of debate in India on economic liberalization only on foreign direct investment is, to my mind, highly misplaced. POSCO, if it comes in observance of all the rules and laws that we have, fine. But if it's not prepared to do that, then let them stay where they are, and somebody else will come and develop the resources there. Then there was the last question, foreign, what was it?
Foreign law firms.
Foreign law firms. My stated position on reforms, and this is a point that I'm going to make tomorrow when I talk at the dinner, is that when we talk of economic reforms, we want to touch the moon. The point is, do you have hands long enough to touch the moon? And if you don't, then you better confine yourselves to what is possible. I am a great reformer. I introduced budgets in which I talked about great reforms. Many of them remain unimplemented to this day. Even foreign direct investment in retail was an idea that we did toy with. But when we realized that it is not practical, then we didn't go ahead and implement. So in a democratic polity, it is very important that you look at what is possible to be done and what is not possible to be done. And there is no point in striving to do something for which there is no consensus. And if there is no consensus and there is in fact a great deal of opposition, then you are going to land yourself in the situation in which unfortunately we are today. Totally, what shall I say, irrelevant, sterile debate in which India and our friends abroad are involved. There are so many things that we can do. I mean, nobody has stopped anybody from generating more power in India, from building more roads in India, from improving the rural infrastructure, from having better cities. So why all of a sudden start only talking about foreign direct investment in retail? And, there is a saying here in this country, don't fix it if it ain't broke. I don't know what is broke in our retail system. We are all very happy shopping the way we do, that we should go and hit at that and raise this controversy.
Okay. I was just being told now that we have to end at around 2 o'clock, so I'll have to ask you
1 minute.
No, you can answer the questions, but if you could be fairly brief.
I'll take 1 minute.
Appreciate it.
Well, as far as the first question on the technology-driven growth, there's no dispute at all. I mean, human history is testimony. I mean, technological advances changed history, innovation of gunpowder, innovation of paper, innovation of the microchip. But even there's no doubt of it. But then if India has to emphasize on it, much greater state investments are required in your higher education. And that is where, I think a lot of effort is being done, but nothing really has materialized. But I think we have not realized the potential. We can. Today with about less than 15% of our youth eligible to go to colleges, go to colleges. And Telugu, my language, is the second language in Silicon Valley, I believe. So they say. With this small number reaching higher education, if we are able to do that, imagine 30-40% of our youth actually getting into higher education. Well, who can stop India from being the leader of world's innovation? We have that potential. We have to realize that. And that's where the investments will have to come. And that is where it has to be public investment. And you cannot wait for any foreign investment to come into these areas, number one. Number two, alternative forms of democracy. We've discussed all those issues very, very thoroughly. Remember one thing, India's diversity and plurality remains unmatched in the world. You cannot have a monolithic political system with a pluralistic social order. The politics has to reflect the society. So how do you refine that? And that is where I think Indian democracy is actually in a process of maturation. And your decentralization of power to the panchayats now, if it works well, that is the answer for involving people at the lower levels. And it's begun to work well. And what is really very, very pleasantly surprising and very, we all feel nice about it, 50% of reservation for women at the lower level panchayat has actually thrown up and brought in, has actually taken care of a large number of problems of gender inequality. And gender, there's still many serious problems that need to be addressed. There's no doubt about it. But that is the process. That is the way. Thirdly, on the question of POSCO and rule of law, I entirely agree with you. Law has to be supreme for the Indian people, not the foreign investor. And today, I don't know if you followed it. I just saw it after landing here. a very big controversy that's been generated yesterday by the Union Minister for Tribal Affairs, telling the governor of Andhra Pradesh, saying that he invoke his special constitutional authority and cancel licenses to 6 mining licenses that have been given for bauxite in the same zone where POSCO is coming. Now, this is naturally, I mean, it's a big political controversy. I mean, how it will turn out, we'll have to wait and see. But you're right, there, I mean, the priority should be, and that's what we've always stood for, first implement the rule of law for the Indian people and not be so preoccupied with your foreign investment. And I remember once Mr. Sinha's budget, I think you were very ambitious about foreign investment. And even then he targeted about the total amount of foreign investment that will come in, never exceeded 10% in any, the most ambitious of Indian targets. Never. I mean, it's not even thought of that it will be more than 10% of our total investment. So it is absolutely, I mean, it is very right. I mean, and that is the point that we are always making. That because I disagree with all the other things which NK said about banking reforms, insurance, and about pension funds. And I would say, and honestly, I want all of you to just reflect upon it, a final thought, that if India had really opened up these sectors, we would have been devastated with the global financial meltdown. We would have been completed, and that's my opinion, maybe he may disagree. But this amount of foreign investment that will come in these sectors would still be what? 2% of our GDP? I mean, you know, how, I mean, is that the priority? Or you have this huge unexploited market in India. You have these investable funds that are siphoned off through these mega corruption scams. Invest that into Indian infrastructure. And that is where the maintaining the rule of law and actually more sustainable growth will have to be come about. I think that is
okay.
And only one final point. I mean, all of you here think about it. Obama 4 years ago in his first election campaign said that we need a new turbocharger for the economy. Remember, he used the word turbocharger. He said we have been building, on cheap credit, we have been building bubbles that keep bursting. It's not sustainable. We require a new turbocharger. That never came. And you're still trying to create those bubbles. I don't know, in second term, if you win something, what is the new turbocharger comes in? But if you keep on following that idea is to build a bubble and sustain the economy, it's not going to work.
Thank you very much. NK,
thank you very well. I'll just take 1 minute. Let me first begin from where Sitaram Yechury ended. One of the good things in ending this discussion is that we agree to disagree on this particular thing. I believe that the opening up of the insurance and pension and the other sectors will be enormous value to India, not only in terms of capital flows, because we know very well that foreign investment have a role beyond mere capital flows into improving total factor productivity and into bringing improved technology and improving the entire culture in which you can have and move towards faster rate of economic growth. But I want to address this question on the different form of democracy to say that I entirely agree that we are pretty comfortable with this form of democracy. What we need to do, and you use the word bottoms up, is to strengthen the implementation of Constitutional Amendment 73rd and 74th Amendment to strengthen the local Panchayati Raj institutions in actual devolution of financial and administrative power to really make them viable democratic entities, which the Constitutional Amendment had really at that stage endeavored to do. Their implementation remains patchy, and we need to monitor that. I think on this question of POSCO, I don't want to add anything to what has been said, except that the rule of law must be fully respected and must be fully accepted. On this last point of allowing legal firms to really also come to India, I think that at a facetious level, let me say that it reflects the power of lawyers when they become finance ministers. And I think it also reflects unduly the power of lawyers. I think Mr. Sinha had once remarked that too many lawyers in government, and I think that guarding their turf, irrespective of the different forms of government, when you have lawyers as finance ministers, not opening up to accountants and not opening up to the legal discipline could be an axiomatic turf guarding reflex. No, at a non-facetious level, let me say that this is an issue which is currently under debate and discussion as part of the WTO negotiations on Doha, because there will have to be a mutuality of arrangement which would need to be broadly acceptable. And I think that there was this issue of the innovation. There is no doubt that we need to improve total factor productivity, improve capital output ratio, and in many of the conundrums which we face and many of the contradictions which we face, we need to find out-of-the-box solution through innovation-driven social growth. And I think that it will be fair to say that India is too complex a democracy to have a Washington-type consensus in which you have one paradigm which will be equally good for every part of India. And because you need to find local solutions to issues which you face them, you need to really use technology and innovation. And setting up 14 technology universities, which is our intention, is only the first step to how to make the Indian growth story a technology-driven story, because we need to improve the productivity of labor and capital, to improve the incremental capital output ratio, and that is where a 34% in investment gearing ratio will get you not merely 8%, but 8% plus rate of growth if we improve total factor productivity and incremental capital output ratio, which only an innovation-driven society can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So on that note, thank you very much for such substantial inputs to our discussion. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you all next year at a similar event. Thank you very much.